Her husband left after the baby girl cried, but the silent rancher took them in and gave her his name. The wind carried a mournful cry across the prairie, a sound that came not from the howling sky, but from the lungs of a newborn child. Her little voice echoed against the emptiness of the land, reaching a man who rarely let sound stir his soul. That night, under the dim light of a flickering lantern, a young woman sat with her child in trembling arms, her heart breaking into pieces. Her husband had walked out just as quickly as the baby's cries had filled the small wooden cabin. He muttered excuses of sleepless nights and burdened days, but the truth was sharper than any word. He could not bear the weight of a daughter's cry, nor the responsibility of their fragile life. With a door slammed against her hope, she was left alone, her baby girl pressed against her breast, both of them shivering in the cold silence of abandonment. For days, she moved through motions like a shadow, her body exhausted, her spirit wounded. The neighbors whispered, the townsfolk judged, and the nights seemed longer than the days. Each cry of her baby pierced deeper, not because she resented the sound, but because it reminded her of the moment he turned away, leaving the child's first breath unanswered by a father's hand. She did not ask for pity, nor did she find strength in sympathy. Instead, she clung to survival, with bare cupboards and a heart too heavy for prayer. Beyond the town stretched land that seemed endless, fields of waving grass broken only by the fencing of cattle ranches. On one of those ranches lived a man whose voice was seldom heard. His presence carried more weight than his words, for he had learned long ago that silence could speak louder than the promises of men. The townsfolk called him the silent rancher, not because he lacked language, but because he rarely spent his words on trivial things. He worked the land from dawn to dusk, his face marked by the sun, his hands by labor, his heart by solitude. He had buried love once, and with it, the desire for chatter. One afternoon, while delivering feed to the store, he noticed her. She stood near the entrance, her child wrapped in a blanket too thin for the autumn wind, her hair undone, her eyes searching shelves not for comfort but for survival. She counted coins twice, her fingers trembling as she placed them on the counter, choosing between bread and milk, between her own hunger and her baby's need. Her little girl whimpered softly, and he watched the way the woman rocked her gently, murmuring lullabies though her own lips quivered from thirst and weariness. Something shifted in him then, though he gave no outward sign. His silence was a cloak, but beneath it stirred a quiet conviction. He left the store without a word, yet when she stepped out moments later, she found a sack waiting by the door. Flour, beans, dried meat, and cloth. No note, no claim, only provision. She looked around, confusion in her eyes, but the man was already astride his horse, riding back toward the horizon without a glance over his shoulder. It was not the last time. A week later, when her woodpile dwindled and the cold pressed against her cabin walls, she woke to find fresh logs stacked neatly by her door. When her baby's cries grew weaker from illness, a small jar of honey and herbs appeared beside the cradle. Each gift came without sound, each act without demand. The town began to notice, whispers circling about the silent rancher and the woman left behind. Some mocked, some pitied, but she only bowed her head, torn between gratitude and the fear of owing more than she could give. One evening, after the baby finally slept, she sat by the small window and wept, not from weakness but from the weight of holding everything alone. A knock startled her. It was not loud, but steady, certain. When she opened the door, he stood there, hat in hand, eyes lowered as though the words he carried had to fight through years of silence to be spoken. "Cold nights are coming," he said, his voice rough, almost unused. "You'll need more than scraps to see you through." She stared at him, searching his face for pity, for charity, for any trace of what men often expect in return. But she found only steady eyes, honest as the land he worked. She nodded, unable to trust her own voice. He stepped forward, carrying a bundle of blankets and a sack of potatoes, then left as quietly as he came. Over time, his visits became less about supplies and more about presence. He would chop wood while she rocked the baby, mend a fence while she hung laundry. He did not invade her space with talk or claim, but his silence grew into a comfort, a shelter. She began to realize that not all men's footsteps led to departure, some led to endurance. The baby grew stronger, her cries now filled with life instead of sorrow. The little girl reached for the rancher's hand when he passed, gripping his rough fingers with surprising trust. At first, he stiffened, unused to such small warmth pressing against him, but slowly he allowed it. A man who once lived without laughter began to find his silence interrupted by a child's giggle, and he did not mind. Seasons turned, snow melting into spring, and the bond between them deepened in unspoken ways. The woman found her strength again, no longer bent beneath shame but lifted by the quiet steadiness of the man beside her. One evening, as the sun sank golden over the fields, he stood before her with the same gravity he brought to his work. His words were few, but they carried more weight than speeches. "You and the girl deserve a name that won't be left behind." Her heart trembled at the meaning, tears rising unbidden. She had lived with the scar of abandonment, with the fear that her daughter would grow up defined by absence. But here stood a man offering presence, not through grand promises, but through every silent act that had already spoken louder than any vow. He gave them his name, not as charity, not as rescue, but as a covenant born from quiet strength. And though he spoke little, his silence carried the sound of commitment, of a life built not on what had been taken away, but on what was steadfastly given. The prairie wind still carried the cry of that little girl, but now it blended with laughter, with footsteps upon solid ground, and with the soundless assurance of a man who had turned silence into a language of love. The land stretched wide under the open sky, endless as the silence that had so long defined his life. Each day he worked the ranch with steady rhythm, the creak of saddle leather and the lowing of cattle filling the space where conversation might have lived. He had built his existence on routine, on the earth and the seasons, on sweat and the labor of his own hands. He had learned not to expect change, not to reach for what could be taken away. Yet ever since he had stepped into that woman's life, ever since he had heard the desperate cries of the baby girl who had been left without a father, his silence had begun to feel different. It was no longer a shield against the world. It was becoming a vessel, a place where new voices might one day lie. The woman, though scarred by abandonment, began to walk more upright with each passing week. She carried her daughter in her arms with a new kind of fierceness, as though daring the world to try and take what little she had left. When she worked, her sleeves rolled high and her hair tied back. There was strength in her movement, though sometimes when she thought no one saw, her eyes clouded with memory. She still bore the weight of the night she was left alone, of the echo of a slamming door that had split her heart into pieces. Yet the steady presence of the rancher began to mend what she thought could never be healed. He never pressed her to speak, never demanded that she unfold the full story of her hurt. Instead, he worked beside her, wordless, letting his actions become the language that she had longed to hear. When fences sagged, he set them straight. When the roof leaked, he patched it. When her hands blistered from washing or her body shook from weariness, he stepped in quietly, lifting the weight without making her feel small for carrying it in the first place. The baby, little Sarah, was the thread that bound them together most strongly. She was born of abandonment but was growing in love. At first, she cried through the nights, her wails tearing through the woman's heart until she felt hollowed out by exhaustion. Yet the rancher began to come by in those hours, knocking softly at the door when he saw the lantern burning too late. He would take the infant in his strong arms, rocking her with surprising gentleness, pacing the room in slow circles until her cries melted into sleep. He never said much in those moments, but his quiet humming, low and steady, seemed to calm the baby and mother alike. As spring gave way to summer, he invited them out to the ranch. His home stood sturdy against the vast prairie, wood darkened by years of sun, the corrals filled with restless horses and cattle grazing beyond. She hesitated at first, wary of stepping into another man's world, but he assured her with his silence more than his words. He didn't want to take from her, he wanted to give. When she walked through the doorway with her baby on her hip, she felt something she hadn't known since before betrayal: safety. She began to help in small ways, cooking meals in his kitchen, mending shirts that had long been torn at the seams, placing her daughter's soft laughter inside walls that had only known quiet. At first he lingered at the edges, watching, unsure if the warmth of family could truly return to him after so long in the cold of solitude. But as days stretched into weeks, he allowed himself to step closer. He found himself listening for the child's giggle when he came back from the fields, found himself lingering at the table longer than he had in years, just to see the woman smile. Still, shadows of the past lingered. The woman sometimes awoke in the middle of the night, startled by dreams of abandonment. In those hours she would hold her daughter tightly, whispering promises through tears that she would never let anyone take her away. The rancher often noticed the weariness in her eyes the next morning, but he did not cry. Instead, he carried extra weight in the day's work, giving her space to breathe. When she finally spoke of her fears, it was not in a burst of words but in quiet fragments, shared as they sat side by side mending tack. She told him of the night her husband left, of the silence that followed, of the shame that burned when people pitied her. He listened without interruption, his hands still, his gaze fixed not on her but on the horizon, giving her the dignity of speaking without judgment. When she finished, he only said, "You're not alone anymore." Those words, few as they were, carried more than any speech. She believed him, not because of what he said, but because of what he had already proven with every silent act of care. As the seasons turned again, life began to feel less like survival and more like living. They worked the land together, the baby growing into a toddling child who loved to chase chickens across the yard and laugh at the ranch dogs. She clung to the rancher's leg with a trust that grew deeper each day, calling him, "Pa," before either of them expected it. He froze when he first heard it, his breath caught in his chest. The woman saw it, her heart pounding, and she waited, afraid he might correct the child, afraid the wound of his past might be too deep. But after a long silence, he bent down, lifted the little girl into his arms, and held her against his chest. From that moment on, a bond was sealed, though no formal words had yet been spoken. The town noticed, of course. Whispers traveled fast across wooden porches and store counters. Some praised his generosity, others doubted his intentions, but the woman and the rancher paid them no mind. Their lives were not built on gossip but on the quiet foundation of shared labor, shared struggle, and the growing strength of love that did not need to announce itself. In time, he did speak the words that had been waiting inside him. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in fire and gold, he stood before her with his hat in his hand. His silence stretched long, but she had learned that silence with him was never empty, it was always gathering weight. Finally, he said, "A name is more than a word. It's a home. You and the girl, you should have mine." Her heart broke open at those words, tears slipping free though she tried to hold them back. She had once thought herself discarded, unworthy of permanence, her child doomed to bear the mark of abandonment. But here stood a man who spoke little yet promised everything. She nodded, unable to speak, and in that moment, their lives joined not by ceremony but by the steady truth of commitment. Afterward, life on the ranch grew richer. The little girl, now with his name, ran freely across the yard, her laughter chasing away the old ghosts that had haunted both of them. The woman found her smile returning more easily, her steps lighter, her heart no longer shackled by fear. And the rancher, once known only as the silent man, discovered that silence could be filled not with emptiness but with love so steady it needed no constant reminder. The land bore witness to it all, the turning of seasons, the harvest of crops, the birth of calves, and the steady weaving of three lives into one. There were still hardships, storms that battered the fences, sickness that swept through cattle, nights of worry and days of exhaustion. But they faced them together, never again alone. The silent rancher, who had once buried his voice in solitude, had given them his name. And in return, they had given him something even greater, the sound of a child's laughter ringing across the wide prairie, the warmth of a woman's smile waiting at the door, and the unspoken truth that love, once thought lost, could rise again from the quietest of places. The prairie had a way of swallowing sound, stretching silence across the fields until even a whisper seemed like it belonged to the wind. Yet within that silence, life pulsed steadily on the ranch, stronger each day, shaped by hands that knew both loss and endurance. The woman and her little girl had once been fragments, abandoned and overlooked, but now they were threads woven into the rancher's days. What had begun as acts of provision had grown into something deeper, something unspoken yet undeniable. Mornings began with the crow of a rooster, the first light creeping through wooden shutters. The woman would rise quietly, careful not to disturb her daughter still curled beneath quilts, her small fists tucked beneath her chin. She would stir the fire, knead dough, and place bread to bake, the scent filling the cabin long before the sun had climbed. The rancher, already at work outside, would pause when the smell drifted across the yard, his stomach growling but his heart warming more than anything else. He had eaten his meals in silence, each bite taken more out of necessity than enjoyment. Now, each meal carried with it laughter, chatter, the occasional squeal of the little girl demanding, "More butter, Pa." He never grew tired of hearing her call him that. The first time, it had startled him, awakening memories he had long locked away. But the child's innocence had broken through his barriers, and now each time she tugged on his hand with those words, he felt anchored, rooted in a way he hadn't believed possible. The woman noticed, too. She watched how his eyes softened when the child clambered onto his knee, how his calloused hands became gentle as he braided her hair with clumsy patience, how his silence now seemed less like a wall and more like a harbor. There were still moments when fear crept into her heart, fear that this peace might shatter, that he might leave as her husband once did. Yet each day he stayed, each day he worked beside her, each day he placed the girl upon his shoulders to show her the endless horizon. That fear weakened. Summer heat pressed heavy upon the land, and with it came the strain of long hours. Cattle needed tending, fences mending, wells watching. The woman worked beside him when she could, her hands blistered from labor yet never complaining. He noticed her strength, how she carried burdens without seeking pity, and his respect for her deepened beyond measure. Sometimes he longed to tell her, but his words often caught in his throat. He had never been a man of speech. Yet one evening, after the cattle had been driven into the lower pasture and they sat on the porch with the child asleep inside, he managed to speak. "You work harder than most men I know," he said, his voice low but certain. She looked at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. Compliments were rare in her world, rarer still from men who meant them. "I only do what needs to be done," she replied. He nodded slowly. "That's more than enough." The silence stretched after that, but it was not empty. It was filled with meaning, with the truth of respect and admiration. She felt her cheeks warm, though the evening air was cool, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope for something more than survival. Autumn came, painting the prairie in shades of gold and rust. The harvest brought long days and aching backs, but also a sense of reward. The little girl toddled about, gathering stray apples in her small hands, her laughter echoing against the barn walls. She had grown stronger, her once fragile cries replaced by songs and babbles that filled the house with joy. At night, she curled up in her bed with her rag doll, and the woman often lingered by the doorway, watching her breathe, gratitude flooding her heart. The rancher noticed these quiet moments. Sometimes he joined her at the doorway, his tall frame casting a shadow beside hers, their shoulders brushing lightly. They never spoke then, for words were not needed. They only stood together, watching the child who had become the center of their world, knowing that love had already taken root between them without ceremony. But the world beyond their walls did not always rest easy. In town, gossip grew sharper. Some men scoffed at the rancher for taking in another man's wife and child, mocking him for raising a daughter not his blood. Some women pitied the woman, whispering that she had tied herself too quickly to a man of silence, a man they claimed carried ghosts too heavy for a family. The words reached them, but neither let them take root. Their lives were not built on the opinions of others but on the steady rhythm of days lived honestly together. Still, the woman sometimes felt the sting of shame when she walked through town. She remembered how her husband had left, how neighbors had watched her fall apart, and though the rancher's presence gave her dignity, old wounds bled at the edges. One evening, after returning from town, she sat quietly at the table, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. The rancher noticed. He set down his cup, watching her closely. "They still whisper," she admitted at last, her voice breaking. "They look at me as if I'm less, as if I'm not enough for this child, not enough for you." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then he leaned forward, his eyes steady, his words slow but firm. "Their whispers don't build fences. They don't feed cattle. They don't raise children. We do. That's enough." Her eyes filled with tears, but not from shame this time. She nodded, the weight on her chest easing. He reached across the table, his hand rough but warm as it closed over hers. He didn't release it until the tears had dried, and in that simple act, she felt more valued than any praise could have given. Winter arrived with fierce winds and snow that swallowed the land. The ranch became their fortress, firelight flickering against wooden walls, the sound of the storm outside softened by the laughter within. The child pressed her nose against frosted windows, marveling at the snowflakes, while the woman knitted scarves by the fire. The rancher repaired tack by lamplight, his presence steady as always. Yet winter also brought challenges. Feed ran low, storms broke fences, sickness brushed close. One night the child burned with fever, her tiny body trembling as she cried out in pain. Panic gripped the woman, memories of abandonment surging as she held her daughter close. But the rancher did not falter. He rode through the storm to fetch medicine, his coat frozen stiff, his face raw from wind, but he returned with what was needed. He sat beside them all night, his hand steady on the child's back, his silence a shield against fear. By dawn, the fever broke, and relief washed over them like spring rain. That night, when the child finally slept, the woman looked at him with new eyes. She realized then that he had already given them more than a name. He had given them his life. And though he spoke little, the truth was clear. He had chosen them, fully, without condition. The days rolled on, each one tying them closer, until their lives were inseparable. They worked together, ate together, laughed together, and even grieved together when hardships came. The woman found her heart no longer haunted by the past but grounded in the present. The child grew not with the weight of absence but with the strength of belonging. And the rancher, once defined by silence, discovered that silence could indeed speak louder than words, because it carried the weight of love that needed no constant reminder. And so, beneath the vast sky and upon the unending prairie, the silent rancher, the woman once abandoned, and the little girl who had cried for a father grew into a family bound not by blood, but by choice, by endurance, and by the unspoken vow that none of them would ever be left alone again. The snow lingered longer than usual that year, burying the land in white silence that mirrored the rancher's nature. Yet even as the winds tore through the plains, the cabin glowed with warmth. Firelight flickered across the walls, casting shadows that danced over the woman's face as she rocked her daughter to sleep. The child's cheeks were rosy from the heat, her breathing even and soft, and the woman felt a wave of gratitude wash through her chest. She remembered the nights not so long ago when fear pressed against her like the cold, fear of hunger, fear of loneliness, fear that her child's cries would echo unanswered forever. But now, in this cabin, with the silent rancher near, those fears faded. The rancher moved with steady purpose even in winter's harshest grip. He rose before dawn, his boots crunching over snow, his breath fogging the morning air. The woman would watch him from the window sometimes, her hands around a warm cup, marveling at the strength he carried without boasting. He was not a man who asked for praise, yet everything in his life was built upon sacrifice and perseverance. She often wondered if he knew how much his quiet presence had saved her, not just from the cold, but from despair. One night when the storm roared fiercest, rattling the shutters and threatening to snuff out the fire, the child whimpered in her sleep. The woman tightened her hold, her mind flashing back to abandonment, to the husband who had left her the moment responsibility became heavy. For a moment her chest tightened with panic. Then she felt a weight across her shoulders. She looked up to see the rancher draping his own coat around her, his eyes steady, his silence saying more than any words. She met his gaze, and something in her heart shifted. She realized she was no longer carrying her burdens alone. Spring came reluctantly, the snow melting into streams that carved their way across the fields. With it came work. Fences broken under snow had to be mended, cattle driven to pasture, barns cleared and patched. The woman worked beside him, her hands blistered, her back sore, but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. The child toddled about, chasing chickens, her laughter echoing against the barn walls. More than once the rancher stopped his work just to watch her, his eyes softening in a way that made the woman's breath catch. Life settled into rhythm. He never demanded anything of her, never used his strength as leverage. Instead, he gave without asking, protected without boasting, and worked without complaint. The townsfolk continued their whispers, some praising him for his generosity, others mocking him for raising another man's child. But the woman and the rancher learned to shut out the voices. The prairie was wide, and the opinions of others faded quickly against the horizon. Still, there were moments when the woman's past reached for her. Sometimes at night, when the child had fallen asleep, she would sit on the porch staring at the stars, remembering the pain of betrayal, the sound of footsteps walking away. She wondered if scars could ever truly heal, or if they only lay hidden beneath new skin. The rancher often found her there, her face pale in moonlight, her eyes distant. He would sit beside her without a word, letting his silence stand as a shield. One night she broke that silence with trembling words. "I thought once that no man could stay," she whispered. "That love was just another word for leaving." He looked at her, the weight of her confession sinking into him. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "Love doesn't leave, men do. But not all men." She swallowed hard, her eyes burning with unshed tears. His words were few, but they reached deeper than any speech. She turned her face toward him, and though no kiss passed between them, the space between them shifted forever. As summer rolled in, the ranch bloomed with life. The child grew strong, her small feet sure on the ground, her voice filling the air with songs she made up as she ran through the grass. She had begun to help in small ways, carrying kindling, feeding chickens, scattering seed with her tiny hands. Every task became a game, every moment a joy. She called the rancher Pa, without hesitation, her trust unshaken, her love unmeasured. The woman sometimes watched them together, her chest tight with emotion. She remembered the man who had abandoned them, how he had turned away at the sound of a baby's cry. And now she saw the rancher, silent, steady, enduring, who had taken that same cry and turned it into laughter. The contrast struck her deeply. What one man had thrown away, another had cherished. But not all seasons were kind. One year, drought settled over the land, the earth cracking beneath the relentless sun. Cattle grew thin, water ran low, and every day became a battle against the elements. The rancher bore it without complaint, but the weight showed in the lines of his face. The woman worked tirelessly beside him, gathering what little water she could, cooking meals from dwindling supplies, comforting the child when fear crept in. They fought the drought together, shoulder to shoulder, bound by necessity but strengthened by love. It was during that summer of trial that the woman's feelings for him fully blossomed into something she could no longer deny. One evening, after a long day in the fields, she found him sitting on the porch, his hat in his hands, his eyes tired. She sat beside him, her hand brushing his. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over and closed his fingers gently around hers. The silence between them deepened, filled not with emptiness but with promise. The child, too, seemed to sense it. One night she climbed onto his lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "Pa," she whispered against his chest, "don't ever leave us." The rancher's throat tightened, his eyes stinging with tears he rarely allowed. He held her close, his arms firm, and though words rarely came easily to him, he managed to speak. "Never." The woman heard, and in that single word, she found healing. The fear of abandonment that had haunted her since her husband left began to fade. The rancher had not only given them his name, he had given them his vow. Years began to weave themselves together. The child grew taller, her steps surer, her laughter still bright. The woman grew stronger, her heart no longer burdened by shame but lifted by love. And the rancher, once a man defined by silence, discovered that silence could hold more than loneliness. It could hold family, trust, and the unspoken strength of devotion. The prairie bore witness to it all. It saw the storms that battered their fences, the droughts that tested their will, the harvests that rewarded their labor. It saw the nights they spent gathered around the fire, the mornings they rose to meet the day together, the quiet moments of love that needed no declaration. And through it all, the rancher's silence spoke the loudest. It said, "You are mine. You are safe. You are home." The years unfolded as the seasons did, marked by labor, laughter, and the steady pulse of endurance. The prairie was not always kind, but it was honest. It gave what was worked for, withheld what was not, and in its vast silence, it taught lessons that could not be found in books or sermons. The rancher, the woman, and the little girl, once broken pieces scattered by abandonment, were bound together by the land's rhythm until their lives could no longer be separated. Little Sarah grew with the wild grace of the prairie itself. She learned to walk among chickens and horses, her small fingers trailing along fence rails, her voice echoing against barns. By 5, she was chasing calves with fearless delight, her giggles making even the most worn-out evenings feel light. By 7, she was riding her own pony, her dark braids flying in the wind as she urged it across the fields. The rancher watched her with quiet pride, his heart swelling each time she called him Pa. She was not of his blood, but she was of his life, and that mattered more than any lineage written in family Bibles. The woman saw it all, her heart a storm of gratitude she could hardly contain. Sometimes at night, after Sarah had fallen asleep, she would stand at the window and look out at the land. She remembered the night her husband had left, the echo of the door slamming, the crushing silence that followed. She remembered sitting in that dark room with her infant, believing that life had ended, that hope had died. And then she thought of the silent rancher, the man who had come without asking, who had given without demanding, who had stayed without question. A man whose silence had become her fortress. But life, as always, tested them. One summer, a sickness swept through the cattle. It started with a cough in one steer and spread like fire, weakening the herd until nearly half were down. The rancher worked day and night, his shoulders heavy with worry. He rode to neighboring ranches, seeking advice, trading for medicine, fighting to save what he could. The woman stood beside him, nursing calves, hauling water, tending fires in the dead of night to keep weak animals warm. Sarah, though still young, carried buckets, her small face pinched with determination. They lost many cattle that season, and the ranch's future hung by a thread. Whispers in town grew cruel. Some said the rancher had cursed himself by taking in another man's wife and child. Others said he'd gone soft, distracted by family. But when the woman heard these words, she no longer bent beneath them. Instead, she lifted her head higher, her voice strong. He saved us when no one else would. His silence speaks louder than your gossip. While you whisper, he works. While you doubt, he endures. And while you judge, he builds. The rancher heard of her defense later, and though he said nothing, his eyes softened when they met hers, gratitude deep as the prairie itself shining within them. The sickness eventually passed. What cattle survived grew stronger, the herd rebuilt slowly, and the rancher, though scarred by the loss, carried on. That was his way, not to dwell on what was gone, but to work for what remained. The woman often marveled at his resilience, how he could bear so much without breaking. She realized it was not that he felt less than others, it was that he carried pain differently. His silence was not absence, but strength. As Sarah entered her teenage years, she became the joy and pride of the ranch. She had her mother's fire and the rancher's steadiness. She learned to ride, rope, and mend fences, but also to read, write, and dream of the wider world. The rancher encouraged her in both, giving her the tools of the land but never chaining her to it. "This is yours if you want it," he told her once, his voice low. "But your life is more than fences and fields. You'll choose your path." Sarah looked at him with fierce devotion. "Pa, this ranch is in my bones. And so are you." The words nearly broke him. He turned away to hide the moisture in his eyes, but the woman saw, and her heart swelled with love deeper than she had ever known possible. Time, however, does not stop. It moves with the seasons, sometimes gentle, sometimes harsh. The rancher grew older, his shoulders stooped, his hair touched with gray. Yet his silence remained the same, steady, unbroken, strong. The woman too carried the lines of years upon her face, but her spirit shone brighter than in her youth, no longer dulled by shame or fear. Together, they had built something unshakable, something the prairie itself seemed to bless. But every story bends toward a final chapter. One winter, harsher than most, the rancher fell ill. At first it was a cough, nothing more. But the cough deepened, his breath grew shallow, and fever burned within him. The woman sat at his side night after night, cooling his brow, whispering prayers, her heart breaking with the thought of losing him. Sarah, now a young woman, refused to leave the house, tending fires, fetching water, holding his hand when his strength faltered. For days he drifted between sleep and waking, his silence heavier than ever before. The woman wept quietly, remembering all the years he had carried them, all the times he had stood without complaint, all the love he had given without ever needing to say the word aloud. She realized then that love was not always spoken, it was lived. On the fourth night, when the wind howled like a beast outside, he stirred. His eyes opened, dull with fever yet steady as they found hers. His lips parted, and though words came rarely, he forced them now. You were left once, but never again. I stayed, always. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she gripped his hand. Yes, you stayed, and because of you, we lived. He turned his gaze toward Sarah, who knelt beside him, her hand clasping his. Daughter, he whispered, his voice breaking. You carry my name, carry it strong, she sobbed, laying her head upon his chest. I will, Pa, I promise. The fever broke by dawn. His strength never fully returned, but he lived through that winter. The woman and Sarah tended him with devotion, and though his body slowed, his silence continued to speak. It spoke in the way he watched them with love, in the way he still rose to mend fences though Sarah begged him to rest, in the way his presence filled every room with safety. And when his final day did come, years later, it was not with abandonment or despair. It was with peace. He lay in his bed, the woman's hand in his, Sarah's tears upon his chest. He looked at them both one last time, his silence filled with all the words he had never spoken. Then, with a final breath, he closed his eyes. The woman wept, but it was not the same kind of weeping she had known long ago when she was left behind. This was grief, yes, but also gratitude. For he had not left them in life. He had carried them, protected them, loved them, in his own steady way. And even in death, he had not abandoned them. His silence remained in the walls, in the land, in the very rhythm of the ranch. Sarah stood tall at his grave, her mother beside her, and spoke with a voice clear as the prairie wind. He was our Pa. He gave us his name, and he never took it back. He gave us his life, and he never left. His silence was louder than any words. And we will carry him always. The woman closed her eyes, feeling the truth of it. She had once been abandoned, her child left without a father. But the silent rancher had taken them in, given them his name, and shown them that love was not in grand speeches or hollow promises. It was in the staying, in the giving, in the silence that never wavered. And so their story ended not with loss, but with legacy. The ranch carried on, Sarah at its helm, her mother guiding her with wisdom. The land thrived, cattle grazed, seasons turned. And in the wind that swept across the prairie, they still heard him, the silent rancher, whose love had spoken without words, whose presence had changed everything, and whose name they bore with pride. Because he had stayed, because he had given, because he had loved, and in the silence of the prairie, his love remained eternal. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.